we just, oh yeah, okay, so the meeting is in progress. So we just get going. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining this intimate working group that we have for Placemaking Europe for reimagining urban retail districts that David and I sort of started maybe about three, 4 months ago. We've been talking about it for a while. And of course, with the situation that we have with the recovery from the pandemic and seeing a lot of our towns, cities, high streets struggling, we really felt it was necessary to create this sort of diverse group from people from different countries and different cities, and to get the conversation going from the Placemaking Europe network. And so far it's been fantastic. I mean, the last one that we had, it was talking about alternative currencies, and it was a really interesting presentation. And this time we also decided to continue the presentations and to have and invite different people to come in and chat to us. So this session, fantastic, Hasanul, that you can join us. Hasanul Hoque from Camden Town Unlimited, and Charles Landry. And Hasanul, just to, before we kind of start, you sort of touched on this tension, of course, because I think that's what struck out to me when I met you a few years ago, when there was a gathering, I think it was at London School of Economics, and it was about all the different improvement district models that were out there. And we had the real kind of hierarchical ones like Germany, where it's run by the chambers of commerce, to ones like yours, where they were incredibly creative, innovative, and really kind of entrepreneurial, actually. And so I thought it would be really interesting to have you present to this group and to chat about a little bit about what you do. Of course, as the operations director, we've had a lot of exchanges, of course, recently. But just to, I guess, to read off a little bit of what you're doing, you're the operations director at Alternative Camden, Camden Highline, Camden Town Unlimited, and Camden Collective, and Euston Town. Of course, you're also an urbanist as well, and you've won many awards for the work that you've been doing along the bids and the innovation district. So it would be great to hear from you, and then after that we'll have Charles, who of course we all know. Of course, he's a author, speaker, international advisor on the future of cities, and of course the founder of the Creative Bureaucracy. And so I think it would be good afterwards to have this exchange about this tension of this need that we need to innovate, we need to think about things differently, but then of course we have the rules, and how flexible can we really be, how much can we really experiment. So on that note, I won't hold you any longer there. So Hasanul, I hand over to you.
Thank you. What I'll do is, I'm quite the same way with the organization, we're quite organic. Because there's so many different topics and areas to touch on, I want to keep this more of a conversation. So if there's any areas that anyone's like, oh, don't understand this, like what is a bid, or if there's other areas like you think you're more interested in, then just please shout and just say, could you elaborate on something? So I guess I'll start off with myself. I've been with the organization 10 to 11 years now. Our organization is quite good at taking people from the job center, and I've sort of grown with the organization over the years from an intern to the ops director now, and helped us open several organizations. But all of that was very organic. We didn't have a vision to be managing 2 or 3 different areas, to have bids, a charity, and a highline organization. There wasn't that, how shall I put it, overarching vision. This is where we're going to be ending up in 15 to 20 years. We started with the basics. We just said, okay, what does Camden Town, which is our first business improvement district, need? Who are our communities within the business improvement district area? And what sort of needs does that those communities in that area have? So Camden Town bid starts from, for those that are not familiar, Chalk Farm Road, which is the north end, to Mornington Crescent, which is the south end, and it's circa about 500 to 600 meters long in terms of length. It has about 300 businesses and companies that are eligible. So business improvement districts, for those that don't know, have a threshold where, or some do not have a threshold, where the business rates are how you collect the levy via the local authority who collects that levy for you. You're elected every 5 years, and then once you're elected, based on a manifesto that you create, like a business plan, you ask all the businesses that are eligible to vote, would you like this manifesto? Would you like us to try to deliver these deliverables? And we'll deliver those based on the money that we collect from everyone, typically 1% of the business rates. That model varies country to country. In America, they're predominantly based on property and landowners, whereas in the UK, it's predominantly on the occupiers. So on the one hand, you have it's on the owners, and in the UK, it's predominantly occupiers. But we have now also introduced property owner bids that sit above and have to be only in areas where there's a property occupier bid, where the property owners can also have a bid where they're charged a levy to deliver various needs that they may have for the area. So our journey started off with Camden Town Unlimited, the business improvement district, and we started off with very basic needs: cleaning, security, all the sort of basic things. So it's kind of like a progression. Most bids will start off with the easy wins, and I guess you can say the very less innovative approaches, less risky approaches, because you want to get a lot of wins under your belt. You want to be able to demonstrate value to the community, the business community in particular, and you want to be able to show them why you're here delivering what you will be able to deliver for them. And then off of that strong foundation where people believe in you, you can sell that vision. So our vision was to try to create Camden Town into a area where startup businesses want to come. So we were thinking about how can we be a bit more innovative than just do social media campaigns, adverts on newspapers. How can we attract the next generation to Camden Town rather than just paid advertising, for example? That's what a lot of traditional bids would do. So we thought we want to occupy the empty spaces. This is post the credit crunch. We thought we want to occupy the vacant spaces that we have, and we want to trial subleasing effectively. So originally we used to lease the properties and then sublease to different occupiers, and then we would then pass on the lease to the new occupier, which is quite high risk, which is why the local authority didn't want to take part. This is about 10 years ago. So you can imagine pop-up shops back then were very innovative, were very risky. It was a concept that a lot of local authorities didn't understand. So of course, our local authority, when we invited them to take part with us, were a bit hesitant. But once the ball got rolling, we had 2 or 3 pop-ups. The local authority said, we'd love to be part of this. They gave us some funding. It grew over a couple of years down the road. Then there was funding available from the GLA to help high streets come back to life. We applied for funding through the Mayor of London. We scaled it up. So we ended up with about 12 pop-up shops. But what we discovered in that journey was there was opportunities above these retail units. There was all this empty space. A lot of retail has a lot of empty space above them, and we started to fill it with young entrepreneurial type individuals. And I would say there's not necessarily 2 levels, but there's distinctly internal creative and innovative friction, which is within your organization. So thinking outside the box in terms of what is the possible within the organization, and then having that freedom to think like that and that ability to dare, if you know what I mean. And then once that organization has that freedom or capacity to think like that and make plans like that and create a vision, then that has to be translated to the rest of the community, the rest of the stakeholders, and you have to sell that vision to the local authority, to the wider community. And it's learning, what we found is it's learning how to translate that value to the different stakeholders. So for example, to the local authority, you're talking jobs, business creation, increasing business turnover. You're talking about local job creation, all those sort of metrics that they value. When you're talking to a property owner, for example, who's sitting on an empty property waiting for the next occupant, you're saying, look, We're going to save you on your business rates. We're going to save you cash, basically. You won't need to provide security for it. You won't need to pay for the upkeep of it. We'll exit the building or leave the building whenever you need it. So it's learning the language of the different stakeholders. When it comes to the local communities, it's explaining, would you like empty shops on your high street, or would you like us to populate it with young people or trial different types of businesses in there? So it was always about selling the strategic vision to everyone. The vision itself doesn't change, but it's how you translate that to the benefits that sort of resonate with the different stakeholders. So we learned to basically speak the language of each different stakeholder group. So the local authority, the residents, the businesses, the property owners, and it was really important to make sure that everyone was on board together. So originally we were quite unique in terms of our board setup. So we have about 21 board members, and our board has resident association representatives, the local businesses, of course, because they're the ones who pay, local authority councillors. We've had the local authority leader several times on our board, but we've got quite a wide representation, including local police representation on our board, which is quite, it's no longer unique, but at the time it was very unique, because a lot of bids felt as though businesses are paying for these services, or that's where the money is coming from. Therefore, only businesses should be on the board. But we recognize that for us to be able to move forward and get past these frictions and barriers, we always need the whole community on board. That means the local authority, that means residents. We needed everyone's buy-in. So if we had their representatives on our board, we saw it as a positive, because we felt as though all the innovation we're trying to create is born out of common issues, common problems, whether that's crime, whether that's economic needs, whether that's job creation. We're all basically talking about the same issues, but translated into different versions of what people understand. So we were very keen on making sure from internally in the organization, we had the right representation, the right leadership, and then they could feed back into their communities. But then we also had the right team as well. So internally as an organization, we're always trying to create that freedom to innovate, or we don't call it innovation, it's just the freedom to be wrong, basically, and try different things out. It's you can call it innovation, but it's really just, you're not gonna, it's not like the local authority in a sense where when a politician, for example, makes a statement and creates a project, now they want to see it to the end, even if it means the death of the project. We're not proud like that. We're more like a private entity. If a business doesn't make money from a product or service, you're guaranteed they're going to stop selling that product or service very quickly. So in that sense, a bid is a lot more reactive to the market. And in this market, it's the high street. In this market, it's how our services are used by the end user, if you know what I mean. So in that sense, we're a lot more commercially sensitive. Commercial is probably not the right word, but we're more market sensitive, user sensitive in that sense. We're always trying to get the best return on investment, because again, we still have to come back to our business to show them the value that we're creating. And then whether that's grants, we have to show the local authority or central government the value we're creating for them. So we always want to be able to pivot. That's where we significantly reduced what we do in terms of pop-up units, in terms of retail, and found the highest return on investment we were getting in terms of business creation, job creation, was actually the back office. People needed office space, which wasn't quite evident in the beginning, but as we evolved, we were comfortable with that. Just because it's more sexy to be on the high street and show the shops and have all of the sort of, don't get me wrong, that got us the most publicity, but the best return on investment, economic and social return on investment, was actually the back office. So now we primarily focus on office space, because a lot of the businesses are saying, we can find a shop, or we can use your help to find a shop, but what we really need is somewhere to think, somewhere to work, the back office side of things. So we pivoted several times. We had market stalls in certain spaces where things were time shared, because a lot of people were saying they couldn't afford to spend 7 days a week with a market stall. So we said, okay, then you can have the shop or a market stall on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then someone else has it on Thursday, Friday. Then someone like a student might have it on Saturday, Sunday. So it was always organic, always moving, always changing, but it was also our flexibility. Our spaces from day one have always been 24/7 spaces. You could access them with a key fob. If we were the local authority, for example, there would have been a lot more emphasis on, oh, who's going to look after the space? How's it going to work? We can't trust people. So a lot of the oil of innovation and the sort of the easing of friction comes from trust. Trusting communities, trusting your stakeholders, trusting your team members, trusting the relationship between the stakeholders, making sure that everyone has that trust. There were points of friction, for example, where initially when the local authority wanted to partner with us, we said yes. Then one of the occupiers of the pop-up shop were basically selling, how should I put it, slightly more adult lingerie and like leather strap type arty sort of men's straps and those sorts of things. We thought it's great, it's interesting, it's different. If that's what the Camden Town is known for, the punk culture, its diversity, we thought it's great. But the local authority straight away said, take our logo off of that. We can't have our logo on it. Please let us know before something like that goes in anywhere, because we want to vet things or we want to filter things. And we kept on trying to explain to them, look, we're not putting our branding on everything, because we're not trying to say it's the equivalent will be Alphabet, for example. Alphabet don't put their logo on Google or on Android or on all the products and services that they have. Those things are independent. They're not trying to water it down with the parent brand effectively. If the product or service is successful, they want those communities to adopt them and feel as though it's theirs. So it's the same thing for us. When we do pop-up shops via the brand of Camden Collective, our charity, we don't put our logo everywhere all over it. So we encourage the local authority not to basically, because people, they think things are a lot less cool if you involve local authorities or for, I don't know, for whatever reason, or governments and stuff like that. They think, oh, maybe it's not organic or it's not cool or those sorts of things. The same way, likewise, if it's the bid doing it, they might think, oh, it's the corporates doing it. This is just a bit of a CSR exercise sort of a thing. So I'm not saying that's what will make or break a project, but we weren't that, how should we put it, we weren't so keen on the credit necessarily. The right individuals, like our board members, our membership, knew we were behind those projects. But the stakeholders, the beneficiaries, didn't necessarily need to know that. So it was basically breaking those barriers down and those friction points. I'm just trying to think of other friction points that we had. I guess that communication piece, once we landed at learning how to translate the benefits, but in that journey to learn those languages, there was a lot of friction because we didn't understand why shopkeepers or the owners weren't interested in giving us pop-up space. We're thinking, you're empty for the last 6 months. Why wouldn't you want us to bring life to your shop and those sorts of things? So we had to learn what those barriers were. When it came to the local authority, we had to learn why they give certain projects funding and not other projects funding. We had to learn the language. When we put in the application forms, we had to learn the right keywords, for example. When it came to our own business community, we had to explain the value of bringing in new businesses into the area. So a lot of bids were really baffled that businesses were paying for competitive businesses to come into the area. And we tried to explain to them either areas on the up or on the down. And it's the broken glass theory. The more empty shops are on the high street, the less people want to be on the high street. Therefore, you want more people. It's a good problem to have. There's too many businesses trying to come into the area. It's not, that's the right sort of problem to have. And then perhaps I'll touch on quickly, actually, how much time have I got? I don't know if you want me to keep going or I'll just touch base with everyone, just get a sense.
No, it's okay, just continue a wee bit, it's fine.
So I guess if I go into the practicals of a different project, for example, Euston, we've got the Drummond Street project. It's a very ethnic community there, predominantly with the Bangladeshi community there. They're very rooted in old school business, traditional. They don't have websites. They don't do open table where you can book a table, for example. So what we're trying to do is, we've successfully done is got funding to put street furniture out for them. And this is where it gets interesting. They didn't see the value of having seating outside and tables outside. They were more keen on having the parking outside their business than having street furniture that would attract businesses and a marketing promotion around that and social media campaign. They were so caught up on signs, physical signs pointing to their businesses, parking spaces so that people could drive to their businesses. They were so rooted in the old ways of doing things. They didn't see the value of a website, for example. These are quite elderly gentlemen. They most predominantly non-English speaking as well. So it was quite a journey. I had to get quite involved because I am Bengali speaking. So I had to we had to hold their hand to say, these are the values of being online. These are the values of us putting street furniture out for you. This is the return on investment of one car coming versus several customers possibly sitting outside your business. So we had to translate that return on investment for them. We had to say, look, we could pay for a sign outside your business, but that's money better spent on social media campaigns, Facebook advertising, or Twitter or Instagram, for example, and bringing in celebrities who basically can promote your business for you. Trying to explain how it's important that they're visible online and people can book a table. They didn't understand that. They're like, no, people will find us. Everyone comes first come, first serve. And we're like, the new demographics are very keen on seeing their food before they eat it, looking at reviews, being able to book a table. They don't want to just show up somewhere without knowing there's a table. There was that sort of educational process, but it goes back to understanding the community. We obviously gave them a long list of ideas and translated those ideas, but we had to also then communicate the value of those ideas and interventions for them. So sometimes, even though something may seem like a good idea, until you translate it, now they're completely on board. They love it. They're like, oh my God, it's the obvious thing to do. We've always been on board, but they weren't in the beginning. It's because that translation of the return on investment, the translation of the value of the interventions was missing. So until we did that, that was a friction. Those were great creative opportunities for them to evolve and utilize new things, but that I guess community interaction was missing, or that barrier of communication was a big friction point for us. Sometimes the friction is very practical things, having the right translator or having the right, like the local authority were on board. The only problem was the community. Effectively, they weren't the problem, sorry, the language barrier was the problem. So these frictions can come up in all shapes and forms, whether it's financial, whether it's internal within your organization, whether it's with the local stakeholders, whether it's the local authority, even the community that you're trying to help. Sometimes the community turn around and say, that's not what we want. But I'm not saying we know what's better for them, but being able to translate the values of the different options is very important, because they'll traditionally go with what they know. And even if that means them going for a slightly lower, or even in some cases really bad return on investment, if you know what I mean. So those are the sorts of friction points we came across. I think there's so many other examples I can give you and so many other projects I can talk about, but I'll let people come in and ask questions, or if there's an opportunity, I'll talk about other projects and other friction points.
Thanks a lot, Hasanul. I think Laventa, you had a question there in the chat. Maybe you can just speak.
Yes. Thanks a lot. It's very interesting. I just wanted to ask about one particular detail that you mentioned, that you encourage shop owners to share the spaces, or shopkeepers to share spaces. And I'm really curious of your experience, because what we encountered in this within this is that there was a lot of conflict between the different kinds of uses of the same space. So while, it's intuitive to share spaces, but in practice, we had a lot of conflicts around this. I'm curious of your experience about this.
So our most recent example is yesterday, actually. I was at a meeting where we were talking about communal public space. So going back to the Houston example, this is public street furniture, tables and chairs, which would ideally be for communal use. All the businesses would all maintain the tables and chairs and look after them and shut them, the lockable spaces, and they would all share them. Completely against sharing. They were like, no way in hell are we going to share. We're not sharing this public space, even though it's public space, even though it's funded by not funded by themselves. They were not interested in sharing. So just so that we could move on with the project, we said, okay, then we will allocate a fair, equal allocation to each business. They turned around and said, no, we want it to be based on the size of the business. And we're like, look, if we try to base on the size of the business, some people will have almost nothing and some people will have a lot. So we said, look, everyone's going to get the same allocation, and then everyone's going to look after their allocation. So you're responsible for it. And then that is how we kind of got over that hurdle, and we're installing on the 8th or 9th next week of June. So we're going to install that. A lot of them still would like table service. So we said, look, we're going to be organic. We're going to let you guys and ladies try out solutions, and then we will try to basically manage it organically as it happens. When we use the shops internally, for example, when it came to sharing, we created schedules to say, look, these are the schedules that we would all mutually agree on. We sat down all together, for example, with a shop owner, if they're going to be working with another occupier, to say, look, this is the memorandum of understanding. It's more of a social contract. So we literally have social contracts that people basically sign in as themselves, as individuals, not as the company, basically. So we create memorandums of understanding, which are headed by the local authority and ourselves. And then we ask them to declare that they will adhere to these memorandum of understanding. It's not legally binding, but it creates more of a social contract that they feel a bit more obligated to follow the rules. We can't guarantee that people will. There will always be those that behave badly. And ideally, the rest of the community police those individuals and say, hold on a second, you're not doing your part, or you're behaving badly, and everyone else will basically monitor those individuals.
Thanks. And maybe just little dimension of the same question, if it's about sharing spaces one after the other, no? You mentioned maybe somebody's using on Tuesday and Wednesday, others the same space, indoor space in this case. With storage, of course, because people, selling stuff, they have the stuff in the corner or in the, so how do you deal with this? Is there guarantees? Are there specific contracts for that?
So everything is at each individual's risk. So any contents or products that they own, they have the option of locking away in small lockers. So we had locker space, or the market stores themselves have storage underneath them. So they were all on platforms on wheels. So our spaces could be event space, but also market space, or everything was fluid, so that we had multiple uses for those spaces. So sometimes it might just be one occupier Monday to Thursday, but Friday, Saturday, Sunday it's a venue, for example, or a cafe, for example. So storage was at individuals' risks, much like our workspaces. So when someone comes to the workspace, your laptop is there at your risk, your belongings are there at your own risk. Everyone signs that social contract to understand that, because no one's paying us anything. A lot of the time people don't pay us anything. So when people do pay us, it's easier because we can basically have a contract with them. This is how much it costs. These are the services you get, and these are the terms and conditions. But when it's not a service that they're paying for, it's a bit more complicated. It becomes an understanding. They sign that to say they understand the risks and that they will use this service under that understanding.
Thank you. Thanks.
And just to add on this question, where is the threshold when somebody pays you and when somebody doesn't pay you?
So the threshold is not black and white. We basically look at how much social value are you creating in terms of local jobs created, but also are you outgrowing us as well? That's the primary metric. So for example, each building is different. Some buildings will have some free allocation and then some below market allocation. Some spaces will be completely free, but it's like an ecosystem. Each building subsidizes another building. And the way we decide if it's time for you to go into paid space or move out of the space is if you've outgrown the space. If you've gone from a team of 2 or 3 and now you've got a team of 20, or you're about to grow to a team of 20, for example, because you've raised loads of capital, which is great, we will try to find your home locally. If not, we give you our blessings and then you move on, sort of a thing. So it's quite natural in that sense. If you go from a team of 2 or 3 to 4 or 5, that's fine, but there's a capacity restriction. So it's usually based on capacity.
I'm conscious of the time, and also I'd love to pull in Charles at this point as well, and also to perhaps co-moderate as well, Charles, that you want to sort of stimulate the discussion with your thoughts and kind of provocation.
Yes, the way I got into this conversation was having a chat with Rosina, and it was just stimulated by various things we're doing with the Creative Bureaucracy Festival, where we have a series of outlayers. We have the main event, the 4th year is in Berlin, but various places, countries, South Africa, Czech Republic or whatever, and Barcelona are doing related events that feed in. And based on a conversation I'd had in Barcelona and did a presentation to one of their people, and the person who was interviewing him at the time is a Barcelona Global, which is a bit like not a bid for the whole city, but it brings all the partners together and tries to think strategically about where Barcelona goes in the future. And they were struck by just a phrase that is one of the key slogans of the Creative Bureaucracy little book, which is, how do you move from a no because to a yes if culture? I know that's very easy to say, but in broad terms, it's saying, let's be more open than closed. And so in the conversation about a series of events that Barcelona may do from within Barcelona, they were saying, look, everybody thinks of Barcelona and says, hey, isn't this a vibrant, vital place? Oh, isn't it fabulous? Blah, 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 blah. And then when you're actually there and closer to the actual how things work, there are often sort of restrictions. And they mentioned one, which I'm not sure I believe, but anyway, which is if you're a bread shop, you can't sell chocolate. And if you're a flower shop, you can't do various things, in displays. So using the street, obviously, as a stage and a canvas and all of these things that quite clearly in the COVID situation are more important than ever to be able to do things in more imaginative ways. And so the big issue I'm interested in, and I think what you just said, Hasanul, in everything you said, I thought was great and very interesting. The particular thing I was focusing on, and Rosina said, oh, why didn't you come to the meeting, is about which places do we know that actually have a track record of having loosening licensing, who understand that obviously we all need that you need certain health requirements and all of that. We all know that. But within those things, that you really allow the imagination to flourish. And so I was really interested in who might know of examples of places which, and if we could gather some of these places that are good examples, and I think what you're doing, Hasanul, is fantastic, that we could just have it as a bank of great examples we've got collectively. So that was my stimulation. And so to some extent, I throw it out to you, if you don't mind. I know that puts the onus on you saying, yes, I know of a great place, and so on. Is that enough of a little mini introduction?
Absolutely, absolutely, Charles, thank you. Because I think, what Hasanul's doing is quite exceptional, where this, you're allowed to have this kind of experimentation and just go for it as such. But I think well, certainly here in Brussels, it's not quite as easy. And I think we need that kind of room for more experimentation and loosening of sort of regulations. So does anyone have any feedback or anything they would like to say? David, you've gone off mute there. You want to say something?
Yeah, no, I mean, I also wanted to just add one element, as I was hearing Charles explain that, I was thinking, I come from New York, and actually I worked, there's a period I worked for the Parks Agency, and, it's typical bureaucracy, and there, people live for the rules. But I think one kind of comment that doesn't identify a specific city, but from my experience, is that part of it is also like, there's the rules, and then there's the people that are actually there, and some people could take the same bureaucracy and make it more flexible, and others would take it and say, I love rules. I'm going to do everything to stop people, to say no, and all that kind of stuff. And, I think when I went there was a couple of us kind of fresh blood coming into the agency at that moment. And everyone that had been there was just very stagnant, very stuck. They looked for opportunities to say no to things. And then, we were these new people coming in saying, hold on, like within those rules, we can certainly do more than you're doing. So I think one response one thought that I had just in hearing, the question you're posing, Charles, is that, within certain bureaucracies, there's always room for people to bend the rules a little bit or to not enforce them as much. And then I think the other thing, that I was thinking as I heard you say that is, I think there's also a different dynamic between places that are very sort of government oriented and places that maybe have a little more of this kind of private action. For example, bids, like Hasanul was explaining, are much more dynamic, much more on the ground. Places like Barcelona, they're kind of like historically Southern Europe is just very bureaucratic, very rules oriented, and the governments do most of the things that maybe that benefit the public. Whereas if you go to London, the UK, the US, there's more of these nonprofits and bids and other actors that play a sort of quasi-governmental role, but are just much more nimble and much more entrepreneurial. So I think that's another dynamic that occurs to me as I hear your question. I think, a place like Barcelona, probably Italy, probably to some degree France, these countries just tend to be a little more bureaucratic than other places.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. They're more rule bound in general. That in Spain, there's a public administration law, just as an example, which is very strict. Yeah. I mean, clearly, we also know that places like the Netherlands in general have a reputation for being slightly looser and having things like, free zones and things of that nature. I mean, I think the link that I'm trying to see is, I mean, you could think of, in an ideal world, what one could think of is a place which was really crappy and all of that. Then they loosened the rules in a positive way and suddenly it started blossoming. And if one could identify those, I mean, what we also want to do is take then little films of those places we think are interesting. So that's sort of just a sort of side thought. So you could just show that. And obviously the idea is to spread it and placemaking Europe use it and others use these films, etc., etc. Well, nobody seems to have any city that has any loose rules. Everything is strict everywhere, clearly. Hello, Bernardina.
Hello. First of all, sorry for Hasanul that I didn't introduce me in the beginning. I'm an urban designer from Amsterdam. And adding on what you said about the Netherlands in a very global way, there is one magic word. I mean, for sure, Holland has many less protocols, much less protocols than other countries. But in terms of licensing and pop-up events, etc., the magic word is temporariness.
Yeah.
So municipalities that's also a matter of governance. Municipalities have a lot in their own hands, and they, as project leader, they may decide a lot about a street or a commercial zone. So it's a lot of personal debate, which I find exactly goes back to what David was also saying. And under the umbrella of temporariness, plenty of things may happen, and this may be for one season as well as for 5 years. Normally, the time span is about 2, 3, or 5 years, depending on what you're planning, of course. And what is nice is that in there, they allow themselves to experiment a lot. It always has to have a very thorough business model behind. And then they revise it, and they may take it for another turn even. So that's where, and it's always ad hoc. I cannot give you now a pure example, but temporary, then everything goes. That's how it is.
That's great, because that's also true at the bigger level, because when you look at the European Capital of Innovation, the innovations they've driven through the last 35 years, a lot of them are to do with the fact that you say, here's a target, let's just do something. It doesn't matter. It's only an event. But the point is that if it works, it then goes from pilot to mainstream, which is one of the big lessons from those types of programs.
Yeah, and in that sense, I agree. Dutch are more easy to change. If it works, then they will adopt it. That's an interesting part.
Got an example? Or sorry, Hasanul wants to come in. Sorry.
I was going to say that the keyword you used there, temporary, is kind of our foot in the door. So for a lot of the things that we did, everything was meanwhile or temporary or pop-up. Everything was effectively, if it doesn't work out, you can always stop us. So when it was the landlord or the shop owner, this is temporary, it's going to be your shop again. If it was the local authority, well, like, look, if you don't like this, you can close it down. If it was the local businesses, everyone had the right, they felt as though there was the end. But like you say, if they like it, they renew it. And ironically, these things get renewed several times. A prime example is we took on a meanwhile use with TfL. So one of the buildings that they've compulsory purchase order was supposed to be renovated after 12 to 24 months. We've been there 3 years now, and they've just turned around to us and said, we don't have the funding, so we're probably going to leave you in there for another 2 or 3 years. So what we thought could be 1 year is now going to turn into a 6-7 year project. So something temporary. So the example, we've learned from that now. And for example, the Camden High Line is also a temporary project, but it's temporary in the sense of 10 or 20 years potentially. Much the same way the Millennium Wheel or the London Eye was a temporary project. But it went from temporary to becoming not so temporary. So there's plenty of examples, like you say, you're right. I think internationally, if we look under the different descriptions, stuff that started off as a pilot, like you say, or temporary, turned into not so temporary. So that's a very good point you made.
Yeah, yeah. I like the way you say magic word.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. Sorry, I don't know if David was going to say. Laventa, you get any feedback, or any of the others who have joined us, Lucas, Cedar, Louis?
Well, this is very interesting because the temporariness, of course, after the 2008 economic crisis, there's been a lot of efforts to experiment with new uses, and what we saw in many cases in Amsterdam that you can suspend rules which actually may make sense on the long term or make sense for entire larger areas, but make no sense for an experimentation where we can actually watch the results. Because I think many people are afraid, and maybe this is why in Italy you mentioned, or in Southern European countries, there's a lot of very rigid regulations, because once you open a little hole, and I'm saying this after having spent 7 years in Italy, and I love the country, but corruption is very, it's always there if you open up regulations. So you have to really watch out for, and the same thing in Hungary where I am now, you have to watch out for keeping regulations intact, or if you can relax some regulations, then you have to be there and make sure that it's not used to overcome or come around regulations, but it's used for why it is relaxed. No, so I guess it's very attractive to say that we need to a little bit suspend some regulations, but it's we also need to make sure that the law is respected in a way, and then we don't lose out for the strongest player who can actually bend the rules. No, so I think it's a complex and contradictory realm.
Yeah, but I mean the whole idea about the whole public administration project we've got, which is called Creative Bureaucracy, what it's actually saying is bureaucrats, many, can think their way through these dilemmas between agility and structure, transparency, justice, equity. These are all in the bag that we're talking about. The question is that cities develop through time, and we also know that in Italy, for example, that quite often streets had very specific laws on what you have to have a children's clothes shop in that street, and you have to have this, and incredibly defined, which can then actually be, of course, very charming. We know that can be charming because the economics of that clothes shop can't really work. But on the other hand, if we're now just thinking about where we are, where everybody's suffering, and there are great ideas out there, how do you allow these great ideas that hopefully will not be corrupt and all these things to happen? Which is why I find what you've just said very interesting, Hasanul, the way, in a sense, effectively you shared responsibility. Some of the great progressive examples, which breakthrough examples, are when we talk about collaboration, when in a sense there's joint ownership of the decision making. So for example, perhaps the best decarbonization program in Europe is in Leuven, the European Capital of Innovation. The local authority gave up power, shared it with the civil society, business and the university system as 25% ownership of the major initiative that the city has. So they gave up power to increase their influence. So given this is of course a difficult realm, we know, because lots of things have been reinvented over 2000 years, business models and so on, but democratic processes have slightly lagged behind. Sorry, that's all a bit abstract, but the point is, there is a lot of energy out there. A lot of people are frustrated. I mean, I'll just give you, sorry, I'm rambling perhaps, I apologize. But if you think of some of the big initiatives that have really been change-making things, for example, Restaurant Day that started in Helsinki. It was an illegal thing that certain social media savvy people did in 2013. The mayor said, "What the fuck are you doing? You've suddenly opened all these restaurants overnight. This is absolutely crazy." And then the mayor, I'm simplifying it to the mayor, said, "Actually, didn't we say that Helsinki's vision is to be a vibrant, vital so-and-so and so-and-so? This is exactly what we want." And then through a set of discussions, they came to an agreement that how it would operate. So quite often, in terms of innovation, you do have to break the rules. And that, I mean, I'm not saying you always need to break the rules, but in fact, it is true that it often is broken, but based on the principle, ask for forgiveness rather than permission.
I was going to come in with one point about the vehicles that you were saying. So, and the business models. What we found was a lot of business models or certain frameworks allow you to do certain things, while others don't. So if you're a private entity, for example, you can't apply for certain funding. Historically, the local authority couldn't give you certain funding as well, unless it was state aid, for example. We found that we had to change or add new entities because a charity could apply for grant funding, or certain vehicles were more appropriate to communicate with certain community groups. Because the bid, for example, the first thing people do is look up what the bid is, and you have to explain, I'm here as the business improvement district, and automatically that alienates you from certain groups. People look at you. So there's that initial barrier, but there's also that funding barrier as well. And what I found is all of these barriers can be kind of worked around if you use different types of entities or legal structures or vehicles, because all of these structures are just different vehicles to deliver whatever you want to deliver. We just call them different things. They're all similar sorts of outputs. You're going to spend some money to deliver a service or product. So if it's a charity, it's a charitable service or product. If it's a private entity, or now you've got that gray area of your social enterprise, for example. So we've created several entities, all delivering different types of things based on the need.
Different criteria as well.
Different criteria. And I think that's something to look at in different areas, because a lot of bids find it baffling that we created a charity. But it made sense to us to create a charity because A, our spaces now get business rates relief. That's an automatic saving. But then we can also apply for grants that the bid is not eligible for, even though we're delivering the same outputs, job creation, business creation, the bid isn't eligible for that funding. And there were so many advantages. So there's advantages and disadvantages of all the different models. And it's basically working out and being flexible enough to say, actually, maybe we need to add something in parallel to our structure so that we can work around the barrier and be a bit more innovative. It feels a bit of a headache, but that's what startups do. They'll work around the barriers and use whichever vehicle that gets them to their destination. So that's what we did as an organization. We said, if we need a charity because it's got these pros and cons, then let's set up a charity. If we need to set up a new entity for this, then we set up a new entity for that. That's how we ended up with several entities now. And a lot of people are like, what is all of this? Like, who are you, sort of a thing? But we are whoever that relates to that individual or community group or that stakeholder effectively. So I am from Camden Town Unlimited when I speak to someone from Camden Town. I am Euston Town when I speak to someone from Euston. I am the Camden High Line when I speak to certain groups that live around the High Line, for example, but I wear different hats. They don't need to know that, but it's the appropriate vehicles to deliver their needs, if you know what I mean.
There's a question for you here, Hasanul, which is, how does COVID-19 affect your project? Did it help push it forward, or are people more open to new ideas, or does it postpone stuff?
Pros and cons.
What's the biggest challenge for your project?
I would say the con was you can't do a lot of physical things. So meeting in person, a lot of the contractors couldn't deliver certain elements of the physical side of things. But the pros on the other side was we could have more engagement. There was more digital conversation. But I guess on the flip side of that again, there's certain communities that couldn't communicate digitally because they were too elderly or they're not digitally able. So there's a lot of pros and cons. I would say COVID gave us an opportunity to fast track what was needed to be done several years down the line. COVID has just basically accelerated those economic changes and inadvertently social changes that were going to happen in 10 years time, but in 5 months effectively. So what we've had to do is accelerate our ability to make people see the value of these changes. A lot of people are hesitant to change. They like I mentioned before, it's just we had to really quickly adapt our language to say, okay, we were going to do this over 5 or 10 years. We're going to have to do it in the next 5 or 10 months if we want our local businesses to survive. So we've had to change our timeframes quite significantly.
I mean, what's interesting also on the, again, I'm sorry if I'm constantly flipping back and forward licensing, if that's okay, is of course COVID had a dramatic effect on licensing because licensing dramatically loosened because it was the way to do the things that people were already asking for before. Yeah. I mean, you can think
use classes. Yeah, we found that use classes were a barrier for us originally. So for those that don't know, use classes are how you're permitted to use a space, whether it's retail, restaurant, office, or a type of business in particular. The government's now changed that, so there's a lot more. There's fewer use classes, but they allow you to do a lot more broader things within those spaces. But again, that magic word temporary allowed us to do temporary things within these spaces, which were not based on the use class of the original purpose of the space. And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to remind ourselves of the big shift, which effectively placemaking, well, PPS in the States obviously was one of the main arguers 30, 40 years ago, is the way that streets became bigger spaces. And then, of course, the way shops operated was completely different than the restorative restrictions I happen to be just mentioning in the context of that Barcelona thing. Because then, obviously, people are talking about how wide is the sidewalk, but when you're doing this wider thing, the sidewalk is so bloody wide, it doesn't matter if everything's spreading out into the wider street. But yeah, the big question is how much. And I mean, one of the big themes of the next festival happens to be, I'm not advertising the festival, by the way, but happens to be what is temporary and what is permanent through the big transition that we're just going through. And that is quite interesting. And I do think it's quite clear that evidence of things like use class is a very good example, because definitions are getting much broader and much less specific. I'll give you an example of creative bureaucratic action. Calgary, the guy wanted to do something about noise. There's lots of people concerned with noise and rubbish. That's one of the main things we know. That's licensing. Yeah, that's at the heart of licensing, that sort of stuff. He looked at the laws of Calgary and it was 14 volumes. So what he said, this guy, Bill Bryce, godlike figure, said, there is always a reason to say no. When you've got 14 volumes, you've always got a reason to say no. And countries where there is less trust, the volumes of laws are bigger than those that have less trust. And as you know, Hasanul, British, we don't know whether it's good or bad, but the laws and the description have reduced in volume and broadened scope, which obviously means you have to simultaneously develop trust. This all sounds a bit abstract, but that you have to do that. So I think these transitions are going on partly because people are frustrated on the ground because they want to do things. That's my sense. I don't know if people
I think you've hit the nail on the head. We're experiencing those transitions right now based on the market forces or the social forces behind all of this. So hopefully we don't abuse, like one of the other individuals was saying, we don't abuse these powers, and hopefully we can maintain that trust and those I guess you could say community ties, because things can go wrong and then you end up with more red tape and you end up with more bureaucracy. Ideally, we maintain freedoms and good practices. And I think what you are saying is really important, celebrating the good stories, because then they can wash out the bad ones. People circulate bad news or bad examples a lot more frequently than they do good news. For example, within the bid community, people say bids are one-dimensional or they're very basic because those are the examples that are shared. But there's so many examples in the States, South Africa, abroad, basically, of great bids. We always look internationally for our inspiration. We're always thinking, what are other bids doing? There's some bids in America that have set up companies that maintain their local theaters, their public spaces, their revenue generating. And we sat there thinking, hold on a second, why can't we be revenue generating as well? But as the bid, we can't, but we can have a company or entity that is revenue generating beside it that also benefits all our same stakeholders. So I think you're right in the sense that we gotta celebrate these successes and talk about them as much as we can. Otherwise, the good will be defeated by the bad that people keep talking about. Even though there'll be probably few of those examples, it's just bad news travels faster. Unfortunately, I think.
You're right. You're right.
Yeah. I actually had sort of a comment for Charles, and then also a question to Hasanul. One thing, because I know, Charles, you asked at the beginning about sort of specific examples of cities doing interesting things, and I'm not sure this would get to that level, but I remember, I don't have a lot of details on it, but sometimes with bureaucracies, especially big bureaucracies, sometimes you almost need to form like separate sort of departments or whatever that kind of cut through, that cut across different departments. And I'm just remembering there was a department that a friend of mine worked at. Again, I don't remember a ton of details, but within the city hall in New York City, where the whole point was, specifically for retail businesses to kind of cut across different departments, whether it's building permits or, I don't know, things related to sanitation or whatever.
Yeah, I get the point. Yeah.
So sort of these task forces that, had the contacts, could expedite licenses, could expedite building permits, could resolve other issues that they were having. And they were based in City Hall, so they could cut across all the different departments. And I remember, it sounded like a really interesting program because, especially in a huge city like New York, there's just so much red tape. And if you're kind of a little business and a mom and pop shop, I mean, you don't know how to deal with the bureaucracy. So you can get lost and probably even go out of business because you can't, solve those problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of the one-stop shop, which is another way of putting that, is really interesting. I mean, one of, in terms of other sorts of things, like doing filmmaking in XYZ, that's why Toronto is so great, because Toronto is always New York in films because they've got a one-stop shop. And if you want to do anything, it's all sorted in one particular point.
Yeah.
Which to some extent, there's aspects of a one-stop shop in what Hasanul's saying, to what I think.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just a couple of words. I agree with you, basically. Sorry, what you
Sure.
But what I like about what Hasanul was saying was, well, I like the magic word is, I like that, obviously, but I also like that you kept on using the word organic. But I think in order to make it organic and flexible and agile, all of these words we talk about, I think that question of the trust was key, that you had developed. But I wonder whether, because sometimes there's the question of, I mean, Camden, obviously, as we know, has got great opportunity. It's got too much opportunity, perhaps. I'm just flipping out to a place which I'm imagining that is in the real shit. How do they generate the trust? Do you know what I mean? I'm looking at the flip side, the place that is less interesting, the place that is more problematic, if you see what I'm saying, whether the same things could happen.
It's an interesting question, because a lot of people say, of course you can do it because you're Camden town, or of course you can do these things because you're in Camden. But
Yeah.
my counter argument to that is, you know how expensive these things are in Camden town, being in central London. Therefore, where there's one lower barrier, other barriers were quite high for us. So I think it goes in swings and roundabouts. We worked with the costs, and we figured out how to basically navigate those challenges that we had, and vice versa. You had Old Street, which was what we perceived as our competitor. We got to the point where we now have, I think, 7 to 8 co-working spaces in Camden Town alone, and we were credited as being one of the pivotal spaces that helped attract startups to Camden Town. I think it was in the Financial Times. So I would like to think we were the spark that helped create a subdivision within the startup community. Our niche was the creative industries. So we were looking for lifestyle businesses. We were not focused on tech. We weren't looking for high growth businesses. We were looking for,
you didn't look at businesses that wanted to scale up.
Exactly. So we look for a USP, and I would like to hope that different communities are able to find their unique selling points and find those opportunities that they have. Perhaps for them it isn't workspace, perhaps for them it's retail, or it's something else that they can celebrate. But I feel as though it's a lot to do with creativity and having that ability to think outside the box. Sometimes it's what's right in front of you that's valuable. So going back to your question about areas that are less exciting, Drummond Street, for example, the community that's dominated primarily with the Bangladeshi community, that area hasn't got the same international appeal as Camden Town. I doubt anyone on this call knows where Drummond Street is, or anyone.
I've had a Bangladeshi meal there when I was stranded in Euston.
Euston, yes. So it's quite transitory. A lot of people might stumble across it because they were in Euston Station, but it's not a destination in itself, if that makes sense. It's more of a holding place or a transport hub, if that makes sense. So everyone thinks of Euston as a station. Everyone thinks of it as a stopping point. They don't really think of it as a destination in itself. What we've tried to do is, as much as King's Cross has become more of a destination than a stopping point, we're trying to help Euston become a destination in itself as well. So it's like, you can come through, but why not stop off here as well? But beyond that, we're trying to attract people to Euston or Drummond Street in particular as a destination in itself. That community lived off its history, its legacy, but that legacy is dwindling now because word of mouth isn't quite there anymore. And most people discover things on their phone or online. If you're not on Google Maps, then you don't exist. So that is right. We're trying to create the invisible to the visible digitally, and that community that is trying to live off his history and its legacy, we're trying to help them create a new visibility. So like you say, that's quite a hard task, but we're working through that. We're working with the USP, which is, as you rightly say, the food and that sort of South Asian cuisine. So we're playing with that. We're basically using those as our USP to draw people into the area. If you're going to go out somewhere, then why not come down to Drummond Street for an evening or for a meal out and for an experience, if you know what I mean. We're trying to get them to create lunchtime grab and goes. None of them, they're all sit down dining. So we're like, look, we're going to put outside seating so all the office workers, the local hospitals, the local students from the universities can come grab a quick meal, or if you're on Deliveroo or Uber Eats, you can get these delivery people who will come and take your food for you and deliver it, which is a very alien concept to them. They're like, why would we trust someone else to deliver our food? We don't even deliver our own food. So like you say, it's working with what you have and maximizing the value and magnifying that the best you can. So Camden Town was a lot easier, don't get me wrong, but Euston is a challenging place to help. So we've got that.
I mean, the thing that is parallel to all of it is you're working with local resources. You're trying to see opportunities. You're being entrepreneurial in the social sense and in a wider sense.
Yeah.
So there's a certain sort of, I mean, on the pop-up front, is there still a demand for pop-ups in the areas you're dealing with?
Yes. So the demand has started coming up, and people have started doing their own pop-ups. So some shopkeepers, because the concept of pop-ups is quite popular now, some other organizations have come in and started providing pop-ups. So we're quite happily pleased to see that on the high street, we're not needed as much, because there's other organizations and charities.
How many pop-ups might you have, just hypothetically, in a year? In a
year, 3 to 4, I would say. Whereas we would have managed several within a year ourselves.
Yeah.
But we've pivoted from that, and now the market kind of looks after itself, which is great, because if there's a market failure, that's where the intervention should be, whether that's government or startups, wherever there's an opportunity to fulfill a service. But once that need isn't there anymore, you move on to the next need.
Yeah. Bernardina, you said you're a designer. Why are you so interested in this retailing group?
No, I'm also a researcher, and the last research I did in the last years are about sorry, it's all in Dutch, so it's hard to translate in English. It's about workspaces and how the transition in work are changing. So retail is one of the subtopics, and now COVID, of course, accelerated it. But I'm looking at policy influencing and anything that can work towards, all the spatial issues related to work and the work transition.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
It's very generic, but I'm working actually in ecosystems of work in the cities. So I look at the strategy, the business models, and the spatial issues about it. So I think that's that retails now have been pushed really down a hill towards something that was anyways happening. So and I think it's so direly needed, and it's interesting to see how, depending on which city, which part of the city, which level, which scale you're talking, the kind of potential is completely changing. It goes in many directions towards experience economy, more and more, and in others you have to really revive it the old way, and also impact economy is popping up so strongly. So that's why I'm interested.
Yeah. I mean, clearly, in a sense, what we are talking about, I mean, we're doing slightly different angles. I mean, I'm so glad that Hasanul did his big presentation, but essentially it's the experience of a place is part of the story that we're talking about here.
Yeah, because it creates community. It creates the what gives you quality in your city. One of the reasons why to live there, I think.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't know how much time do we have still, Rosina?
Well, I've got to leave in 5 minutes, if I may, in theory. I'm supposed to have been somewhere else a while back, but I'm completely committed to this.
Yeah, no, I think, another, say, 10 minutes maximum, and then we can close up, or as long as we're having the discussion. I think organic is the word that sticks out. So I think but maybe by latest, in the half hour, we kind of close up. But I think what Bernardina was saying there, it's absolutely the case, and it's probably the motivation for our group in starting this as well, that the high street in place is so many things. It's the retail, it's the work, it's the community, and it's all these different aspects. And a big part of, I think, Hasanul, where I also really resonated a lot with what you said with the first time I heard you speak, it's the creativity. I'm also a designer, in this part of the creativity, and we have to start really looking at our high street and businesses in a different way. And I think this kind of design-led innovation, using that creativity as the core and that entrepreneurial approach is so vital. And it's definitely kind of, I would say, the approach that we took bottom up with the bids. Obviously, like Sweden, we don't have the legislation, but it's really using the community and creating these collaborations and working and understanding who's the community. just as you mentioned with the Bangladeshi community, I mean, you really need to know who are the community and use that culture, heritage, and creativity, really. And that is what brings that innovation.
No, absolutely agreed. Yeah.
Any other points anyone else has to make? Bernardina, you've gone off there again. Did you?
I had a question, but it's more to hear your opinion about it. And I don't know if I just open up a door that requires too long. But I know that in England, in London, there are several people moving towards this direction with the Great London Break Authority, trying to help policies for kind of, let me call it, social workspace. And probably there is also similar action for retail spaces. And I could connect this to to a big debate that's started now at the end of COVID in Holland, and is to have what the Dutch call active ground policy. So to stimulate municipality to buy back real estate if it's vacant, and to help. And I wanted to ask your opinion. How do you see, what is the critical mass that a local government could own in order to help the local retail spaces? If you have any cases, if you think it's interesting, if it's something that should be prevented or actually invited. So maybe you have an idea about that.
I quite like that idea because I find when you're working with some landlords who own properties, they'll be sitting somewhere in a beach. It's very hard to get hold of them. They're quite happy to sit on the property empty because it's sitting on the balance sheet, so it's not costing them a lot of money. It appreciates in value, so they're not as focused on what's going on with that one particular asset. It might be one asset within hundreds of assets that they own, for example. So compulsory purchase orders exist for a reason, whether it's for the greater good of a nation or a local region. But I think on a micro scale, on a very hyper-local scale, with the right cases there, if the community can do it, or if the local authority can do it, and there's a social or an economic case, I think it's very good, it's very valuable, because you got to give the landowner an opportunity, or the property owner an opportunity, to say they're going to bring it back to use. But if they refuse to, then I think there's no reason why, as long as they get a fair market value, you shouldn't be able to say, look, this is the fair market value of the space itself. You are causing a detriment effectively to the local community by leaving this space neglected or void, because sometimes they're boarded up, nothing's happening with them. And it might just be a case where the property itself is lost in the system because someone did own it, but then they passed away. Like, we've got one building like that in Euston. The building's got a tree growing out of it, and it's central London. And we're always sitting there thinking, how are we going to find the owner of this place? If we could, we'd compulsory purchase it. So at some point, our ambition as a bid is to set up an entity that will start buying buildings as well, so that we can create community spaces. So the ground level can be retail or whatever services or space the community needs, but we'll have affordable housing at the top to subsidize the debt of the space. It pays off the debt, but then it allows a portion of profits so that we can then pool that money to buy another asset, community asset effectively. And then we effectively use that as a war chest to keep on doing that process. So in our aspirations, it is there for us, and we've already got the funding to do the business modeling for us to start acquiring assets, because we looked at America and a lot of them don't necessarily own the buildings, but they own businesses. So we're not going down the business route, we're going more the business ownership, the property ownership model, where we'd have community assets that we then acquire for community benefit, and then we'd use that to then buy more and more. It's almost like being a social property developer effectively. We won't necessarily develop the property from scratch, but we'd buy something, potentially repurpose it, or we'll use the flexible rules that exist right now, the use classes, the permitted development rights, where you can turn empty retail or office space into residential. So we're going to work with the opportunities that we have. So we've seen those as potential threats, but also opportunities The threat being that obviously you can have everything turned into residential and they're left vacant, which means no footfall or people living in them, and they're sitting on someone's, I don't know, they're like holiday homes. But on the flip side, if the community gets proactive and buys those spaces, whether it's the local authority or a charity or a social enterprise, for example, and then is a bit more entrepreneurial and buys these assets and then lets them out or provides them as housing, then that's fulfilling a need as well. So that's our aspiration. We see an opportunity there, and our aspiration is to deliver the opportunity, but in a social orientation. But I think it's a good idea what you're saying, in short.
Do you mind if I leave? I'm sorry about this, but I'm being hassled.
all live.
So thanks for
Right.
Regina organising this. And Hasanul, perhaps we can discuss again, if you don't mind, a bit more detail, if that's okay with you.
Definitely. Always up for a chat.
Anyway,
yeah, thank you very much, Charles and
Yeah.
Hasanul, for joining. So we'll be in touch for the next session, and we'll just end it here. And thank you, Bernardina, as well. And yep, David, for co-hosting as always. So take care, and
Thank you, everyone.
stay in touch.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. See you soon. Thanks. Bye.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Bye
Thanks.
now.
Bye.
Okay, take care.
Take care. Bye. David,
Yeah,
stop recording maybe.
yeah, let me shut the recording off. How do you do this? Recording.